Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services Zoom News Conference. I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor of Ethnic Media Services and the moderator for today. Today's briefing focuses on data pointing to a worrying trend. Children and adolescents have been dying at increasing rates in the United States over the last few years, and COVID has little to do with it. Between 2019 and 2021, all-cause child mortality rose by 10.7% in 1 year and 8.3% in the following year, the largest increase in decades. Leading causes of death are suicide, homicide, drug overdoses, and car accidents, as well as guns. Guns are an important protagonist in a young person's risk of dying. Gun deaths among US children rose 50% in 2 years, and so far this year, there have been at least 42 incidents of gunfire on school grounds, resulting in 17 deaths and 32 injuries nationwide. Accordingly, life expectancy in this country has taken a downturn. Speakers will present the latest research on the downturn in life expectancy for American kids and the causes that are driving this phenomenon. Many, including the authors of one of the reports that we will hear from today, believe the higher rate of child and young people's mortality is driving the decline in overall life expectancy that the US is experiencing at the moment. Then advocates will join the panel to offer their reaction and discuss potential policies to help address this situation. Our speakers include Stephen H. Wolf, medical doctor, professor of family medicine and population health at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine. Kim Parker, she's director of social and demographic trends at Pew Research Center. Mayra Alvarez, president at the Children's Partnership. Kelly Sampson, senior counsel and director of racial justice for Brady United. We ask speakers to speak slowly, as I'm doing, for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. And we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat, which we will address following each speaker as time allows. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions throughout the conference in the chat if they are able to. We will send the video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today via email. And now we go right into the presentations, and we are happy to hear from Dr. Stephen Wolf. Dr. Wolf, welcome.
Thank you. What's interesting about the panel is I think we're coming at this from different disciplines, all with a shared interest in the same issue. So my comments are coming from the perspective of medicine and public health. I'm a physician and have spent many years studying health trends in the United States, mainly focused on worrying trends in adult mortality and health. And the general notion that we've had for many years when we've talked about these disturbing trends in adult health is that there's generally been good news when it relates to pediatric mortality. Death rates in infants, children, and teenagers in most industrialized countries have been falling for many years, thanks to progress in pediatric medicine and in preventing the leading causes of injury deaths in children, which has historically been car accidents, and other leading causes of injury deaths, such as drownings, fires, and so forth. So that's generally been the good news that we've been able to share in what has otherwise been a dismal picture in terms of the health of Americans. However, recent data suggests that all-cause mortality, which is the term that we use in epidemiology to refer to deaths from all causes, have begun increasing in children ages 1 to 19. This is very unusual. It's not occurred very much at all in the last half century. There have been occasional 1 year increases of a very small magnitude that were immediately followed by decreases. 2 back-to-back years of increases is very unusual. And the increase that's recently occurred in 2020 and 2021 is of a magnitude that we have not seen probably since the influenza pandemic of 1918. So basically a century that we have not seen an increase of this magnitude. Now, as was mentioned in the introduction, we've experienced basically a 20% increase in all-cause mortality in that pediatric age group just between 2019 and 2021. That's a massive increase. And one might be tempted to think that this had something to do with COVID-19. That's obviously the time period when this occurred. But our analysis found that COVID-19 actually explained relatively little of this increase. And most of it was being driven by injury deaths and other external causes of death that have been responsible for this increased death rate. Primarily, these have been caused by trends that predate the pandemic. In some cases, predate the pandemic by many years. So the four causes of death that have largely been responsible for this increase in all-cause mortality are homicide, suicide, drug overdoses, and car accidents. Suicide rates began increasing in 2007 in this population. So more than 15 years, we've been experiencing an increase in suicide rates in this age group. Homicide rates in this age group began increasing in 2013. So the perception that this has something to do with COVID-19 misses what is really a deeper and more long-term trend that should concern us. The increase in drug overdose deaths began shortly before the COVID-19 pandemic, around 2018 or 2019, as more and more children and teenagers acquired access to fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. The COVID-19 pandemic, therefore, didn't cause this trend, but as we say in our report, it poured fuel on the fire. The rates increased very dramatically during this time period. Between 2019 and 2021, deaths in those ages 10 to 19 increased by 39% for homicides, 114% for drug overdose deaths, and 16% for car accidents. Firearms played a dominant role in this increase. They accounted for about half of the increase in all-cause mortality that occurred at ages 1 to 19. Firearm deaths at ages 1 to 19 increased by 41%. And the talk that's following this one about the research by the Pew Charitable Trust will go into more detail about the dominant role of firearms in firearm-related deaths increasing between 2019 and 2021. I think it's important to talk a little bit about the racial and ethnic differences. Young people were not equally affected by these trends. They were more severely impacted among particular racial and ethnic groups. Let's talk first about homicide deaths. Black youth were at considerably greater risk of dying from homicides than other racial and ethnic groups. In fact, Black youth accounted for about 63% of the homicide victims that occurred in 2020. The Black homicide rate among young people was 6 times that of the Hispanic population and 20 times that of the homicide rate in white youth and youth of Asian and Pacific Islander descent. Males across all racial ethnic groups are at higher risk of dying from these deaths than females. So when we think about the intersection between race and gender, we discover even more dramatic differences. So the homicide rate among Black males was more than 60 times that of white females. So these ratios are very dramatic in terms of their disproportion. The racial groups at risk of other kinds of injury deaths differ. For example, the risk of dying in car accidents was highest for American Indian and Alaska Native youth. The rate of dying from suicides was highest in Black and American Indian youth, and those rates were about twice that of suicides in white youth. For drug overdose deaths, white youth have typically been the racial group that has experienced the highest death rate, but overdose death rates in Black and Hispanic populations have been climbing dramatically recently, not just in youth, but also in adults. And by 2020, those groups had reached statistical equivalence with the white population. So basically, the gap has been largely eliminated that had once existed before. So as a physician, these kinds of trends are actually very tragic. When we say all-cause mortality increase for an age group, it basically means that these four causes that we're discussing have offset all the lives saved by advances in pediatric medicine, all the deaths that we've avoided through reductions in injury rates, all of those gains, childhood leukemia, addressing birth defects, reducing premature mortality rates, all of those are now being offset by these four man-made pathogens. So in terms of policy priorities, we can talk about many issues. We probably will during this session, but I'll mention two that I think jump off the page when we look at these data. One is the need to deal with firearms. Gun violence is reaching historic proportions. And when we get to the point where all-cause mortality is increasing for this 1 to 19 age group, that's a very technical way of talking. Put it in plain terms, it basically means the probability of young people reaching age 20 is now decreasing. So our children are less likely to become adults. So we can have our debates about gun policy among adults, but if we get to the point where our children are less likely to reach adulthood, then the need for sensible gun reform cannot be greater because we're now losing our most cherished population. I'll also emphasize that most of those victims of gun violence, at least the homicide victims in young people, are shot by adults. So this is not to exclude the role of dealing with the need for sensible policies for adult gun ownership, but we're reaching the point now where the death rate from these guns is now affecting our young people and reducing their chances of reaching adulthood. So that's policy priority number one is guns. Number two, the mental health crisis in young people. The fact that suicide rates were increasing as long ago as 2007 is an indication, along with other factors, that we need to really address the kinds of depression, anxiety, and other mental stresses that our young people are facing these days. And they're leading not only to fatal outcomes like suicide, but a lot of morbidity from psychiatric and mental health issues. So I'll stop there and let my colleagues speak, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf. Two things jump to mind. Well, you first talked about life expectancy in the U.S. and so that life expectancy in the U.S. stopped growing a few years ago, right? Like in 2010, according to your report. And this is not happening in other developed countries. This is a unique American thing. Also, the rising death in children and teens is also not happening in other countries. What conclusion do you draw from this? What is it that we're doing wrong, aside from guns, obviously? But what is going on? We just had a week where 4 kids were shot just for being in the wrong place. One of them died. Is it a mentality? What is it? Is it the healthcare system as well? What can you give us an idea?
Well, I want to make 2 points. One is that the trend that you're talking about in terms of U.S. life expectancy, which does distinguish the United States from so many other high-income countries, and frankly, some middle-income countries, is very disturbing and has been going on for many years. That's actually been the focus of my career. So since the 1990s, U.S. life expectancy has been falling behind that of other peer countries. And as you mentioned, after 2010, stopped increasing altogether and went flat for the last decade, whereas it continued to climb in other countries. So the gap widened dramatically in the past decade. And then during the COVID-19 pandemic, U.S. life expectancy fell by horrific levels, especially in the Black and Hispanic population, so that the gap between U.S. life expectancy and other countries is now wider than it's really ever been. The main driver of that trend has been death rates in adults. Initially, mid-decade, we realized this was middle-aged adults that were experiencing this. Then it turned out that young adults, as young as their 20s, were being affected. And now what we're seeing is that this problem is reaching down into our teenagers. the major drivers that we're talking about for child mortality are not identical to those that are affecting adults. And we can talk more about that if the audience is interested, but there is certainly a fair amount of overlap. I do want to say that the attention we're getting right now in the news to gun violence in children needs to be put in some perspective, because a lot of attention is going to school shootings and mass shootings, which as a parent, like all other parents, we find tragic and frightening. But the massive death toll from guns that we're talking about here, that's actually shifting all-cause mortality, is not occurring in mass shootings or school shootings. It's occurring in shootings that are occurring day by day in communities across this country that collectively are adding up to this massive death toll that's affecting all-cause mortality.
Gotcha, thank you. I'm going to choose from the questions in the chat. Some of the questions may be answered by the presentations later, but we'll pick them up if there aren't. Henrietta, can you go ahead with your question? Henrietta Burrs.
Thanks, Pilar. Dr. Wolf, you mentioned that most of the young people who are shot by adults. Would youth being shot in gangs be the exception? And could you also talk about the death rates in terms of youth between girls and boys? Is there a gap in their using suicide, for instance, or in homicides?
Yeah, I'll take the second question, is easier actually. And the gap between males and females is very large. Males are at much higher risk of dying from most of these causes than females. The first point, though, as to I believe the question was, to what extent are these homicide deaths related to gangs? And I'll see if my colleagues have any data on this, but I am not aware of good evidence to suggest that gangs represent a very significant proportion of these deaths. I think actually that a lot of these deaths have to do with other circumstances, including domestic violence and other kinds of conflict that occur. Frankly, and we can talk more about this, I think the accusation that these deaths are related to gangs has some racist undertones to it. It's a way of othering this problem so that people who are not affected and not members of low-income communities or communities of color can shake off responsibility for dealing with the problem. I don't mean to discount the role of criminal activity and other drivers, but I don't think it accounts for a very large share of the horrific trend that we're seeing now.
We are going to move on to our next speaker because of time. Dr. Wolf, please stay around so we can direct questions to you. And if you see any questions in the chat that you can answer, we would really appreciate it. We welcome Kim Parker from Pew Research Center, Director of Social and Demographic Trends. Hi, Kim.
Hi, thank you, Pilar. And thank you, Dr. Wolf. I have to say first, as a disclaimer, I am not a public health expert, nor do I have a lot of expertise in crime statistics or gun deaths. This is my main area of expertise is in public opinion and demographic research, but this is a trend. This data was so striking to us, and this is obviously a trend that's very much in the national conversation right now. So that's why the Pew Research Center has done this bit of analysis. So some of the data that I have to share is a little bit repetitive with what Dr. Wolf shared, so I'll try not to go into too much detail. I've got sort of two sets of data to highlight. One is data from this Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, and specifically it's drawn from mortality statistics from the National Center for Health Statistics. And that data comes from death certificates, just to give you a little bit of background about where the data is coming from. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some survey data that we collected at Pew based on a survey of parents that we did nationwide last fall, looking at some of the concerns that parents and kids are dealing with these days. So first of all, the data on gun deaths that the CDC has for children goes back to 1999. So we looked at the trend over time, and I should highlight for you, and Dr. Wolf and I corresponded a little bit earlier today about this. Our data looks at children and teens under the age of 18, whereas Dr. Wolf's, I think, is from 1 to 19. So the statistics are a little bit different, and they actually highlight an even bigger increase in gun deaths among younger teens when you take out those 18 and 19-year-olds. So that's, I think, very striking and relevant. So the data that we looked at did show a sharp increase in both the number and the rate of gun deaths among children and teens under the age of 18. And we kind of zeroed in on that same time frame of 2019 to 2021, with the pandemic obviously occurring, in the middle of that. And the number of gun deaths to children in that age group increased by 50% over that period, as Pilar mentioned at the very opening at the top of the call. And the rate increased by 46%. The rate is the number of deaths per 100,000 people. So the rate is a little bit better of a measure when you're looking at trends over time because it controls for changes in the size of the population. And gun deaths include homicides, suicides, accidents, and other types of death involving a firearm, just to sort of put that in perspective. And over this same period of time, we saw an overall increase in gun deaths in the US of 23%. So, and I think Dr. Wolf mentioned this, so that it's trending up for all ages, but very pronounced among this particular group of young Americans. And among kids in the US, homicides are the most common type of gun death. As Dr. Wolf, I think, mentioned, 60% of the gun deaths to this, children in this age group in 2021 were homicides, whereas 32% were suicides. You see a different pattern among adults, interestingly. Suicides are and have long been the more dominant type of gun death among adults. 55% in 2021 of gun deaths among adults were suicides versus 42% were homicides. So again, that's a very striking and obviously disturbing set of statistics there. And it's also worth noting that homicide is the leading type of gun death among children, regardless of the age of the child. So it's true among teens, but it's also true among the very youngest children when we're looking at gun deaths. So again, another really striking statistic. And as Dr. Wolf mentioned, there are large differences by race that we see. And I won't go into too much of the detail. Our analysis showed the same thing as what Dr. Wolf found, which is that Black children and teens are far more likely than white, Hispanic, and Asian children to die from gun-related injuries. And there are racial differences in the types of gun deaths among children. So in 2021, most gun deaths to Black children were homicides, whereas most gun deaths to white children were suicides. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we found in the CDC data. And again, very much kind of echoes the data that Dr. Wolf shared in a little more detail. And now turning to the survey of parents that we did. Again, this was conducted last fall among parents nationwide, a very large sample where we were able to break the responses down by racial and ethnic groups, gender, income, all kinds of different demographics. And we had one series of questions in the survey that asked parents about the types of concerns that they face, that children are facing these days, the challenges, and to what degree parents are worried about these things. Now, the top concern for parents by far was mental health. And we found that about 76% of parents said they were at least somewhat concerned that one of their children would struggle with anxiety or depression at some point. And 40% of parents were extremely or very concerned about that. And so this just gives you a kind of some context for the environment in which parents and children are operating these days. And I think it's very much related to some of these findings about mortality and particularly gun deaths. So when we asked parents specifically how concerned they are that their children, a child of theirs, might be shot at some point, there we found that almost half of parents were at least somewhat concerned about that, and 22% of parents were extremely or very concerned that a child of theirs might be shot. And we found wide differences there by race as well, but the patterns are a little different from what we see in the CDC data. So in our survey, we found Hispanic parents were the most likely to express a high degree of concern about a child of theirs being shot. 42% of Hispanic parents said they were extremely or very worried about that. About a third of Black parents expressed that same level of concern, and the shares for white and Asian parents were lower, 23% and 12% for Asian parents. We also found big differences by community type among parents. So parents living in urban areas were significantly more likely to express a high level of concern about their children or child being shot than parents in rural or suburban areas. And we also found a very wide income gap, with as many as 40% of lower income parents saying that they were extremely worried about their child being shot, compared to much lower shares among middle, and only 10% of higher income parents expressed a similar view. So you can see there that place and setting really matters in terms of the types of dangers and concerns that parents are dealing with these days. And I know, as Dr. Wolf said, that mass shootings and school shootings aren't the main driver of these trends, and they're not the biggest cause of gun deaths among children, but they still are very top of mind for parents and children. And our survey tapped into that a little bit as well. So we asked parents how concerned they were that there might be a school shooting in a school that one of their children attends. And almost 70% of parents are at least somewhat concerned that this could happen in their child's school. And 32% said that they were extremely or very concerned about this. And so this isn't saying that they're worried their child will be shot in a school shooting, but that they're worried a school shooting could occur in their school, which will obviously impact their child, one way or another. And again, there we found Hispanic parents really standing out. 50% of them expressed a high level of concern about this, compared to 40% of Black parents and smaller shares of Asian and white parents. So that's kind of an overview of what we found with regard to gun violence in our survey of parents. And I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Thank you, Kim. There's a question in the chat about whether or not you have granulated data on mental health concerns of Asian parents.
Let's see. I don't have it offhand, but I bet I can.
Yeah, you can just send that to us later, maybe.
Yeah, I can find it real quick. I know that the mental health concerns, let's see, I have it right here in front of me. Asian parents were somewhat less concerned than parents from other racial and ethnic groups. Hispanic and white parents were equally concerned about mental health challenges for their children, about 42% saying they were extremely or very concerned, about a third of Black parents, and then 28% of Asian parents. That difference is probably not statistically significant, but I think it's probably safe to say that Asian parents are a little bit less likely to be concerned about these issues than white parents are, according to our survey.
And what does that reflect? Is just exposure to the issue? I mean, obviously all parents are concerned about.
Right.
Perhaps.
You mean what do the racial differences reflect? I'm not sure. We had found, we asked a similar question back in 2015, and we found kind of a similar pattern with white parents and higher income parents being more likely to express high levels of concern about mental health. And actually in this survey, we found those gaps were narrowed a little bit. So I think it's elevated in importance, and the level of awareness around these issues is heightened for parents across racial and ethnic groups as well as income groups.
It is striking that mass shootings and school shootings are not the main driver of this trend. You would think they are because of media coverage, and we are media, so we do the same thing sometimes. Are there any trends in your data of, so what are the main drivers of, the increased number of shootings?
Of gun deaths? I think
Yeah,
Dr. Wolf's probably better qualified to answer that. I think he might have alluded to it a little bit earlier.
I mean, we basically become inured to the idea that every night on the evening news, we're going to hear about which shootings occurred in our cities. Those numbers add up. New York, Chicago, Boston, you go through the list of all of our big cities and small towns. These shootings in aggregate are responsible for this vast death toll. That's not to minimize the horrific tragedies that are occurring with school shootings, which to my understanding are increasing in frequency. But still, in terms of the sheer numbers, they are not accounting for the largest proportion of deaths in young people.
Sunita has a question. Sunita Surachi.
Yes, hello. Is there data on parent versus child violence by gun?
Anyone?
Can you clarify?
Adult versus child, you mean?
Well, parents
Or-
should, yeah, specifically.
Oh, within family unit?
Yeah, so as related to domestic violence, yeah.
There probably is, but I'm not up to speed on that.
Yeah, our research was focusing on the death data that are reported by the CDC, which I do not think clarify whether the adult shooter is a parent. But I think FBI statistics do provide that. We have not analyzed that in detail, so I can't give that to you now, but I would refer you to FBI data sources that I think go into that level of detail.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add one thing that that I was talking to my colleague who had actually done this analysis at Pew, and one thing that he pointed out to me was that gun sales increased sharply during the pandemic, and that he was sort of theorizing that access to guns has increased for, obviously, unfortunately, people of all age groups, and that may be contributing to this as well.
Before we move on to our two next panelists, I want to get both of you's reactions to what happened the last week. I mean, 4 young people shot just by coming to someone's door, making a common mistake. This is shocking. I mean, it happened one after the other, and race didn't seem to have a lot to do with it. In some cases, the shooter was white. In some cases, the shooter was black. In another case, the shooter was Latino. Different races in the victims. What is going on? Your opinion, Dr. Wolf?
I think we're all reeling from that news. I mean, it has tremendous implications, not only for the technical matter we're talking right now about gun related deaths, but what it's saying about our society, that people are on such a hair trigger that just a basketball rolling into the yard is enough to set them off. However, on the technical point, and it's related to the earlier question that we were just asking, is that decades of research, it's at least 20 years worth of research now, show that having a gun in the home increases the risk of a gun-related death. The tendency, I think, that it really intensified during the pandemic was for people to go out and buy even more guns than they already have to, quote unquote, protect themselves from perceived threats that I think have been generated a lot by advertising and marketing by gun manufacturers and the NRA, but is not actually a real threat. In any event, this perception that they need to own guns and store them in their house for their own safety is actually a risk factor for people in their families being killed by those guns. So whether it's the parent or not, I could not answer with data at my fingertips. But in general, if a child is going to die, if anyone in the family is going to die a gun-related death, it's more likely to occur because of the gun that's already inside the house.
Yeah, Kim, do you have anything to say?
Oh, I was just going to add one point, Pilar. And I know, as you pointed out, these recent incidents cut across racial and ethnic lines, but in the research that we've done on racial attitudes and experiences, we've seen very starkly in our data that Black adults in the US are much more likely to say that they're treated with suspicion or discriminated against across various settings and realms of life. So I think the incident in Missouri was an example of that, just the assumption of suspicion or danger that came along with that very innocent, ringing of the doorbell is an experience that, unfortunately, we've seen in our data that is not uncommon for Black Americans.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to our next speaker. I just want to point to a really good article today in the LA Times about how, this has put limelight or spotlight on the standard ground laws that have been passed in like 30 states. And apparently data says that homicides have increased in the states that have standard ground laws. So I'm sure we'll discuss more about that. I'm going to invite Mayra Alvarez, president of the Children's Partnership, a longtime friend. Mayra, to comment and react and tell your piece. We can't, Mayra, we cannot hear you well and we cannot see you either. Well, it doesn't matter if we can't see you, but we can't hear you. We can't hear you well. No, your sound is not good. Mayra? Okay, Mayra, your sound is not good. Can you move to another place? I'm going to, okay, there you are. Something's going on with your Wi-Fi or with your, hello, hello, hello. Hello? Okay, she's frozen. Okay. I'm gonna, let's see.
Hear me okay?
Very badly. It's very, 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 very strange. Maybe you.
Is that better, Pilar?
Oh, finally. Yes, thank you. Right.
Oh, thank goodness. You can hear me okay now?
Yes. Go ahead,
Okay,
Mike.
great. Can you see me or should I turn it, could I keep the camera off?
Whatever. I mean, whatever. It sounds fine now. If anything happens and I go crazy, just turn it off.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone's flexibility. Hi, everyone. My name is Mayra Alvarez. I'm president at the Children's Partnership. Children's Partnership is a statewide advocacy organization in California working to advance child health equity. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to respond to this important panel and be a part of this critically important discussion for the well-being of our children, all children, but particularly those most heavily impacted by what these numbers are. I come to this space today as an advocate for children, but I also come to this space as a mom. I'm a relatively new mom, and I'm looking forward to the day that our little girl turns 2 in July. And I hope to see her transition into adulthood. And for so many parents across this country, they have lost that opportunity, as is clear by the numbers that have been shared today.
Mayra, you need to slow down a bit.
Okay, okay.
Thank you.
So I want to start with my reaction and really ground us in who our kids are. You know, around the world and on both sides of the political aisle, the well-being and safety of children is upheld as a universal value. It's generally upheld as a universal value. The United States has established special protections for children. Courts may give special consideration to what is in the best interests of a child in issuing judgments about their well-being. The children of the president and other elected leaders are traditionally off limits to reporters. Even celebrities are afforded a degree of privacy from the paparazzi to ensure their child's well-being. With good reason, it is understood that children deserve special status and need to be protected and taken care of, not only by their parents, but by all of us in society. Yet as we consider the numbers shared today, it seems that the universal value that our children are precious is being left behind. Child mortality in the United States had been in decline for decades, thanks to incredible advances in modern medicine. But this trend dramatically reversed between 2019 and 2021. Child and adolescent mortality rates in our country rose by 20%, the largest increase in the last 50 years. And why? This stark increase is primarily due to the growing death toll from injuries. But let me be clear on what injuries are. Again, deaths from homicide, accidental drug overdoses, motor vehicle accidents, and suicide. Suicide between kids ages 10 to 19. We really have reached a tipping point where these deaths are so high that it's offsetting many of the incredible gains our country, our world has made in treating pediatric diseases. And I want to emphasize to you all that our children are dying from preventable causes. These are man-made reasons why our children are dying, not biological. And what it means is that our kids like my little girl, they're not going to reach adulthood. This conversation, these numbers, they are a wake-up call for all of us, a wake-up call to ensure that we are all taking care of our kids and that we're considering the important considerations for specific populations of children. We need to understand the causes and address them immediately to protect our kids. And based on the data, the multiple causes are clear. So should be our actions in response. As we consider how to protect our children, there's no quick answer, but a consideration of how all of us have this role to play in creating supportive environments that every single one of our children needs to feel valued, to feel loved, and to feel like they belong. Parents and families have a role to play, caregivers and educators, policymakers and community leaders, and every single one of us. It is imperative that we consider the interconnectedness of many, many issues grappling families' ability to raise healthy, thriving children. So when we consider what to do, it is this holistic approach that must be considered in order to support the well-being of our kids. So I'm going to start with the most obvious. It's about the guns. It's always about the guns. I'm going to let my colleague, Kelly Sampson, really speak to this issue, given the expertise that she brings to this call. But I couldn't talk about potential responses to these numbers without also emphasizing the importance of what we need to do to improve gun safety in this country, to pass common sense gun reforms that allow our children to live in homes, to live in communities where they can grow into thriving adults. I also want to emphasize that we must strengthen access to critical public benefit programs. We're on a call about children dying, and I'm talking about public benefit programs. Absolutely. We must make it easier for families to enroll in programs and access the health, the food, the housing, and other supports that they need, because it's all of those issues that impact the mental health of our families, the stress, the depression, the greater anxiety that comes when parents can't afford a child's meal, when parents can't afford to pay their rent, when parents can't take their child to the doctor. Those are all issues that are interconnected and related to the struggle of poverty and what poverty is doing to contribute to these numbers today. So providing access to more mental health services and making our public programs work for families so that they don't have to jump through additional barriers or hoops in order to get the services that they need. This helps respond to the challenges that we know many parents have gone through. An investment in community-centered mental health services and community-defined practices to really think about, what does healing look like for our communities? How can we center the experiences of our young people, of our families, in order to access the services that they need? Youth peer-to-peer programs are one example that young people themselves are saying they need in order to support each other. And then also robustly fund and access and improve access to mental health services for children that have been exposed to gun violence. As has been heard today, this disproportionately impacts kids of color and kids in low-income communities. Recognizing the responsibility to center the needs of young people, we must focus our investments in overall social, emotional, and mental wellness that really is found in community-based programs. In thinking about how we can specifically target the well-being of our kids most impacted by gun violence, we have to think about what that looks like to provide community-informed, trauma-informed services. And these types of investments happen at the local level, at the state level, and most definitely at the federal level. One of those is really integrating a community health workforce and thinking about how community health workers can help families access those services and understand the programs that can better improve the safety and well-being of their kids. It is a multifaceted approach that is needed in order to be responsive to these challenges and to the numbers today. And I'm looking forward to engaging in the conversation to speak more about that.
Thank you, Mayra. I just want to point out to my colleagues that a lot of questions are being answered in the chat, so I'm not going to ask those out loud. So take a look at the chat. The chat will be sent to you afterwards as well. Okay, Mayra, there were a couple of questions in the chat about the role of social media and violent video games on children, and on suicide rates, for example. What's your take on that? What's your opinion about that?
It's a really great question. And I think it's important to keep in mind that social media, like many other aspects of our society, has both pros and cons. It's really important for parents to be engaged in their family, in their child's life, and be able to be more informed about what is happening on social media, what are the types of conversations. So it's not a quick, easy fix to say that it's just social media, it's just video games that is impacting the well-being of our children, and really emphasize the fact that a child's ability to have a safe space to talk about things that they are experiencing, conversations that may be worrying them, bullying that may be happening is particularly important. Whether that safe space is with a parent or with an adult at school or with youth peer leaders, that is open, right, to interpretation and availability. But what's important is that we offer those spaces to our young people, because I think it's, the social media impacts, there continues to be new data about the impacts of what that does. And while we can also absolutely point to negative impacts of social media, there are also lots of information related to the positive impacts of social media and the ability to reach resources where they may not be available to young people. So considering the pros and cons is necessary, and really recognizing that it is not just one quick fix in order to solve these types of challenges.
Oops, I muted myself. Thank you, Mayra. I'm gonna invite Kelly Sanson from the Brady United. She's Senior Counsel and Director of Racial Justice to weigh in. Kelly, welcome.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to really dive into this issue because it's extremely important, as I think the other speakers have made clear. Secondly, just to tell you a little bit about Brady, we are one of the nation's oldest gun violence prevention groups, and we work with gun owners and non-gun owners alike to really bring people together to take action to prevent gun violence. And I really wanted to talk about both the context of these numbers that we're seeing and also some possible solutions. But before I get into the comments I had prepared, I did want to address Pilar's question about what does race have to do with even the shootings that we saw over the past week, given that some of the shooters were different races and some of the victims were different races. Because one important point when we're thinking about gun violence in the United States is that regardless of the shooter, part of the reason why we have a society that is so dependent on firearms and in many ways is an outlier among other countries is related to our history and ongoing white supremacist culture. There's a lot of research out there about why the United States treats guns and the Second Amendment the way that it does. And a lot of it is related to our history of white supremacy and racism. For example, the Supreme Court has taken a departure from centuries of precedent to turn the Second Amendment from a civic right in defense of the state to a private right related to self-defense. And self-defense is racially coded in American culture. Oftentimes, when we talk about self-defense and good guys with guns and citizens, those are all coded as white and often male. And I'm not just saying that, there's research on that front. For example, there was an article in Nature that looked at how society codes people carrying guns in public, and white men were coded as patriots and Black men were coded as threats. And there's also a discrepancy in the way that society thinks about who you need to protect yourself against. And the gun industry has keyed into this idea that there are scary people, and those scary people are not white, as the way they market firearms to sort of induce people who are afraid and want to protect themselves into thinking that they need to buy a firearm. And there's a sociologist named Angela Stroud who actually did a study of gun owners, and she asked them, why did you choose to arm yourself? And this is a quote, frequently reply with answers that highlighted a criminal class of people of color to justify gun ownership. So I can get more into this, but basically there is an interplay even between the sheer number of people who feel the need to arm themselves and the way that we characterize threats and safety that is sort of underlying all of the gun culture in society. That's not to say that everyone who owns a gun is a racist or has gun attitudes. It's more to say that it's a part of the culture and the system, and that plays into the sheer number of firearms in our country, regardless of the race of the people engaged in a given interaction. So sort of continuing to speak about race, as you all have heard today, gun violence is the #1 killer of American children. But within that category, Black children suffer disproportionate numbers of death. And one thing, whenever these statistics come up that we want to be really careful about, especially as you're reporting it in the media, is to not further stigmatize or blame communities that are suffering, because these rates are not a naturally occurring phenomena, but they result from systemic issues. And the stark reality is that because of our continuing legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and ongoing violence and trauma, there's a cycle of violence and trauma that lands with disproportionate force on Black and Brown people. And that's something that's been proven out in the research. For example, there was a paper from NIH talking about how America's deliberate policy choices isolate Black Americans and, quote, marginalize them socially, economically, and politically. And the US Department of Housing and Urban Development did a study analyzing violent crime, and they found that the higher rate of violent crime that you see in Black communities is predominantly linked to the sorts of structural disparities that I just named. So economic disparity, social disparity, political disparities. So basically, when you're thinking about the disparate crime rates and the ways they impact Black communities, but also Black children, those result from these structural issues like poverty and structural racism and the way that they land on with disparate impact on these communities. And so given that gun violence is a systemic issue, we need systemic solutions. And one of the things that we do at Brady is we think a lot about where are the guns coming from? Because the majority of guns start out with the manufacturer and they make their way into communities. And those manufacturers are supposed to comply with the law and be sort of the first line of defense to make sure that guns are not getting into the hands of people who would misuse them. But we know that the firearms industry, which includes manufacturers, dealers, and distributors, they play a role in facilitating easy access to firearms by preventing regulations and avoiding transparency, accountability, and oversight. And so people will often say, well, if someone wants to get a gun, they're going to get a gun no matter what laws we have. But what's important is that a lot of times when people are saying that, they're referring to laws that relate to a purchaser, but not the laws that relate to the industry. And the industry, as the origin of firearms, has a huge role to play. And you can think about it if you use an analogy relating to pollution, for example. If there's a river and constantly there's pollutants coming down that river, you could stand at the end of the river and try to take the pollutants out, and that would be effective. But if you never go upstream and go to the factory that is putting the pollutants in the water, you will continue to have the problem. And at Brady, the way we think about gun violence, especially as it impacts Black and Brown people living in urban communities, is that they are at the end of the river, but the gun industry is upstream. And if we can really deal with the supply of firearms, that can go a long way to preventing gun violence and the trauma that it causes. So one of the things that we do, we have a Combating Crime Guns initiative where we really work with states and the federal government to tighten and make the processes by which the government makes or works to regulate the firearms industry more efficient. Because right now, according to the ATF, only a small fraction of gun dealers sell about 90% of the guns that are traced to crime. So if you could regulate that small percentage of the problematic dealers, that will go a long way to keeping guns from being used in crime. But because of a variety of factors, that regulation is inefficient, or people are able to evade closure or evade losing their license and get a new name and start a new business. So what we've been doing is really working to identify the most problematic sellers. And if you go on our website, which is bradyunited.org, we actually have a map and really help state and federal authorities have the tools to identify which of the gun dealers are most responsible for helping crime, and to then target those specific gun dealers and manufacturers for inspection. And in addition to that, we really are working to make sure that gun laws are strong across the country, so that it's not enough if one state has strong gun laws, if someone can just go to a neighboring state and bring guns in. So we're really working on federal solutions like universal background checks, as well as state level solutions like universal background checks, safe storage laws, and extreme risk protection orders, to name a few. And I realize we're getting really close to time, so I would just say in closing, in addition to all of these sort of supply side approaches to preventing gun violence, we also do support other organizations that are working on community building, community violence intervention, and institutions and programs that will really help communities that are dealing with trauma. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kelly. And I'm happy that in the chat, we have a lively discussion going on at the same time. And a lot of comments and questions have been answered as well. And we are getting close to the end of the briefing. So I want to go around once more to every one of you with final thoughts. And I'm going to start with Dr. Wolf.
Well, I think I want to thank my colleagues for wonderful presentations, and have tried to throw in a few other ideas in the chat. I think we are reaching a real threat point now. I'm old enough to have watched this problem unfold over many decades, and after Sandy Hook, really became very pessimistic that we could achieve change, because the feeling was if that's not enough to move change, what is? I'm hopeful that the next generation and the increasing attention that we're currently focusing on the issue might motivate politicians to pass common sense gun control measures. We need this to protect the health of everyone, but at this singular moment where we're seeing the chances of our young people reaching adulthood dropping for the first time in half a century at least, one hopes that that particular angle might motivate a common interest on both sides of the aisle to save our children.
Thank you so much for your research and your presence in today's event, Dr. Wolf. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Kim Parker from Pew.
Thank you, Pilar. Just as a disclaimer, the Pew Research Center is nonpartisan, non-advocacy, so I can't take a stand on these issues or advocate for policies or outcomes, but I do just want to underscore the importance of this topic, and in particular want to thank my fellow panelists for the very important work that you're doing. And our mission at Pew is to provide a foundation of facts to help inform the public and to inform decision makers and stakeholders in these spaces. So hopefully the data that we're able to supply and some of the data that I've shared in the chat will be helpful in terms of moving forward in a positive way on these issues.
We appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Kim Parker from Pew Research Center. Maida, last words.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today and for this important conversation that highlights that too many of our children are dying sooner than they need to. This is a collective effort to ensure all of our children can transition into healthy adults, to be productive members of society that we all need them to be. Our children, when it comes to gun violence, have witnessed shooting after shooting. And it's these tragedies that are not only going to have long-lasting detrimental impacts on the health of those that have been victims of gun violence, but on the mental health of the millions of children that are watching A sense of safety is necessary for our kids to grow up healthy and thrive. And yet we've seen that parking lots and churches, stores, classrooms, no place is safe. Our children are dependent on the adults in their lives to take care of them. And our elected officials, all of us, have a moral duty to take care of our kids. And I look forward to working together with each of our panelists and each of you to make sure we can make that happen.
Thank you so much. Kelly, last words for closing, before closing.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone, and going through the questions in the chat, one of the things I just want to reiterate is that it is about, when we're talking about gun violence in particular, the access is the key. I saw a question about video games, for example, and there's been some research into the relationship between video games and aggression, and there's not really a strong relationship there at all. And we know that the video game industry is global, but the difference is that in the United States, there's this access to firearms. And so as you're thinking through covering this story, so many of the issues that we have in the United States, whether it be mental health or even racism, they are not exclusive to our country. But what is different about us is the lax regulations that we have around firearms and the ease with which someone who is going through a mental health crisis, or who might be racist, or who is just angry, can get access to a firearm and kill people. So the access is really key, and it's not inevitable. There are things that we can do about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. And we are over the time, but have a good weekend. And remember that we have these parts of this conversation have been on our Twitter. We have live tweeted, and we will send the video to all of you afterwards. Have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.